Today we pick up in Genesis chapter 39. So we finished the last section with Judah and Tamar. And so we pick up now, switching gears back to Joseph in chapter 39. And it's interesting that naturally when you read it, you have Joseph, and then all of a sudden it just switches to Judah and Tamar, and then back to Joseph, and it's almost like you undeniably see that there's a contrast here. And there's almost no way not to see it, because we have the character of Joseph introduced, then you have all kinds of things happening in chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar, and now we see Joseph in a similar situation in chapter 39, switching back to him, except Joseph is down to his very character, utterly most concerned with honoring God and pleasing Him. So it will be good now just to pick up and start reading there in verse 1. It says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there." So in the previous chapter, the chapter beforehand, in chapter 37, you have the Ishmaelites, then the Midianites, and then the Ishmaelites again. And so we can kind of speculate, but I don't think that's necessary. It seems to me, especially since we have Ishmaelites used again here, that this is a title or a term that can be used interchangeably. The Ishmaelites coming from Ishmael, but it could be referring to another group of people. Sometimes in the Bible, it may not be the same group, but that's how, the people of the time may have known to refer to them as. And so sometimes you have things that are used interchangeably. So here you have the Ishmaelites, and also I think an emphasis here is that Ishmael came from Abraham, but not from Sarah, and he was not the promised son. And on the other hand, Jacob, going back to Isaac, who was from Sarah, the promised son. And so you have this continued promise of God. It's going to lead to the Messiah, but here you have enemies of that plan. And throughout the Old Testament, you're going to have enemies against God's plan. But of course, nothing has the power to stop God from working out His plan. And this isn't, again, looking at favoritism in contrast to Jacob showing favoritism among his children. But instead, this is showing that God had to choose a line to execute His plan. And so God made His choice, and Paul in Romans makes the point that He had chosen Jacob before they had grown to do anything wrong. And so what we're seeing is God had to make a choice, and so He chose to go through Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And so we have the Ishmaelites who are still around at this time, and now Joseph, Jacob's son, is sold to this Egyptian master. So verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So two things kind of here that are important. Interestingly enough, it's so easy to read past this. The Lord was with him. And when I first say this, you might kind of scratch your head and like, oh, I don't know about this. Or are we kind of reading into it? But when you study this, this is no doubt an extremely interesting phrase. For example, in other parts of the Bible, you may have that idea, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, or he was full of the Holy Spirit. Or you may have, God was, for example, with Jacob, God was blessing Jacob, and Laban could see that God was blessing him. But this phrase, worded this way, the Lord was with him. Of course, that's the name of God. Some have said Jehovah. You take it straight from the Hebrew. You can come close and call it Yahweh. But this is a unique phrase, and worded this way, it is only used for a handful of people. Now, Again, that's why I'm saying, when I say that, you might be unsure about it. But when you look at the people it is used for, you realize something very interesting. Because this is used here for Joseph, and then it is only used for a select specific group of people. Another one is Samuel, who was the priest who will anoint King David. It is used for King David, but it is implied by saying that the Lord was with him as he was with Saul. So that phrase is not used for Saul, but it's evident from that phrase there that he's with David as he was with Saul, because Saul was the king of Israel. Now, Saul was the first king. So before Saul, who was judging Israel? We learned that Samuel was. He was a priest, but he was leading Israel, judging Israel. In the book of Judges, you have the general statement for all the judges that Israel would turn to idolatry and they would cry to God for help, and he would raise up a judge. And it says the Lord was with that judge. So far, when you track it through, and then Moses and Joshua, it says the Lord was with Joshua as with Moses. So when you go through this phrase, it seems to always be used for the one who God has specially designated to be the leader over his people. So you have it here with Joseph. You're going to have it with Moses and Joshua. Then you're going to have it with the judge who reigned at the time. Then you're going to have it with Samuel. And then it goes down to Saul. But God takes it away from Saul, gives the kingdom to David. And then you only have a select other number of people. For example, some of the kings like Hezekiah. And then you hear of Jehoshaphat later on in Israel's history. And that's about it. Every time it's used, it is designated to the active ruler who God has specifically chosen for Israel. And I think that's valuable because, as we're going to see along here, Joseph is designated as given a task to rule, to execute God's will. Now, he serves kind of as a shadow, and we're about to see some prophecy of the coming Christ. Now, of course, they only had a fragment of the information. So there's no way, of course, someone at that time would not see it that way. But that's not the point. We can see through this whole book and a number of these books, the plan of God being worked out. And we know that leads to the Messiah. And right after this chapter is why we're going to spend so much time on this phrase. Because look here, it's first said in verse 3, the Lord was with him. And then it's repeated in verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. And then it's repeated in verse 23, the Lord was with him. And directly following that in chapter 40, we're going to have a very interesting section about Joseph's dream. And that's going to become important. So let's just remember that. Always used talking about the active ruler whom God has handpicked, whom God has chosen. And now you're going to have a phrase about Joseph ruling over. For example, when you go back to chapter 37, when Joseph first told his brothers the dream, there in verse 8 it says, his brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? I failed to mention this last time when we were there, but this phrase actually has not come up since the beginning of the book of Genesis. When you go all the way back, you got to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 3. First, we would look at Genesis chapter 1, where it says in verse 16, God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. Okay, that happened in creation, but that becomes a theme throughout the books of Moses, that the light is to rule over darkness and separate. That's the word that's going to become to make holy. Well, he's going to use that word to talk about Israel being a light to the nations, and they're separate from the nations, and the light is designated to rule over the darkness. But the problem with man is that they're not ruling over it. They're succumbing to their sin. For example, then we see in verse 28, when God made man in his image, he said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So light was made to rule over. The only other being that was made to rule over was man, as sort of a manager of creation. But the problem is in chapter 3, that man falls to his desire and sin. And you have there in Genesis 3, verse 16, when he's giving the consequence out, the second part of that verse says, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. Okay, we know that's talking about the relationship, about who is submitting to who. It's not a tyrant type sense of the word. In Hebrew, it's just going to be the same word used in all sorts of different contexts. We know the loving relationship in marriage, but he's making a point here about who will have the say when it comes to the final call in the marriage if there's a disagreement. But then you get to chapter 4 of Genesis, where he says, when he's talking to Cain, he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So now, God, through Moses, takes that and applies it to the sin situation, where Cain is being tempted, and now, just like Eve had that desire, and Adam did too, but they couldn't rule over it, and now Cain has that same desire, and the temptation is there. God's trying to stop him and help him, but he can't rule over it. He's having trouble doing that. So this idea of light and darkness becomes the setting where we have this temptation now, and man is expected to rule over it. But man does not do that. Time and time again, Cain, and then the flood world, and then after that you have all those sections we've gone over with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we've seen examples of this time and time again. Well, now this word doesn't come up until Genesis chapter 37, where all these same problems that Jacob is having, God says, you're wrestling with me. And I'm going to give you a physical picture that you've wrestled with God, but God has not prevailed over you, and that's going to become a problem. And finally, Joseph comes on the scene, and he has this dream. No doubt it's a divine dream of his father and his mother and his brothers and sisters, and they're bowing down to him. And that's what the dream means. And they say, are you going to rule over us? And they're upset. And the ironic part is, that's exactly what's going to happen. Because Joseph is going to go through a lot of things, but in the end, they're going to have to come to him for food in Egypt, and he's going to be the ruler over all the land. And so here you have the sons of Israel, but one son is designated to be the ruler. Now we'll get to the end of Genesis when he applies this to the nation of Israel. We would expect that he would give the designation of ruler to the tribes of Joseph, but he does not. He gives it to the tribe of Judah. And he says the scepter and the king's staff will not depart from Judah. You mean even though Judah, we're reading, he does all these crazy things and things that we wouldn't want written about us if God was writing down our life story? Why Judah? Well, it's because it has nothing to do with the person. God has a plan. And he knows David's going to come along, and he's going to make the promise to David that the throne will not depart from your house. So the Lord was with him, and it always is about the designated ruler, but God has David in mind. God knows David's going to come along and going to work out his plan, and the Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Joseph. But Joseph is kind of known as the shadowing of Christ, as there's so much prophecy here. Anyways, that's kind of a tangent, but I think it's an important one to talk about. Now we can get to the second aspect of this verse, which is a more straightforward and direct one. It says in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 39, that his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So you have this statement used of Jesus that says, when he was young in the book of Luke, that he gained favor with God and man. You have the same thing said about Samuel when he comes of age. Now, on the one hand, favor with God. That's the part that's obvious, right? We all want the favor with God. We want to be pleasing to him in our life. But God and man, I think some focus should be drawn to the fact that this Egyptian Potiphar is his master. And he's pleasing to God. Why is he blessed? You see, from a human point of view, that would demand that Joseph was doing a good job. Because yeah, he's having favor with God, he's blessing him, but what would that mean? Joseph would have to be keeping up with his responsibilities. How is Potiphar going to be pleased with Joseph? He made an impact with Potiphar because of his work and his responsibilities. And, you know, we have that section in the New Testament, the ones I wish, having a job. You know how we say in the Bible, truth is truth, and there's the nature of it is it's going to be difficult sometimes. And there's some things in the Bible we kind of wish, maybe it wasn't worded that way. But the section where he's talking about the work that you do, work as if you're working for the Lord. Well, that's not an easy one, because sometimes, employers, they can be difficult, and managers or wherever, they can be difficult. And we're instructed, work as if we're working to the Lord. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there's a difference between that context of someone being a servant when slavery existed versus being an employee. As an employee, you have decisions, you have liberties given to you. So I think we do have to divide that, but that principle of hard work is still there. And with Joseph, his master was able to look at him and say, he's being blessed, and because look at the type of servant he is, and look at how he has his responsibilities and what a good job he's doing. And someone ought to look at a Christian and say, the way they are, there's something to them. And that then becomes a way in which our light does shine. Of course, that doesn't replace preaching the gospel and all these things, but this is just another way that Christians have their influence. And something can be said, and I think we spend time on it today because maybe we spend so much time on the temptation part and our spiritual life and being sanctified. But I think it's a biblical concept, and it should be taught that a Christian man, and if a woman is in the field, a Christian woman ought to be a hard worker. That ought to make an impact on the world. And the world ought to be able to see that. And when it was the case, Joseph was blessed. And granted that the Lord was with Joseph in a special way, but no doubt that Potiphar could look at the kind of man Joseph was, and he could see that he was being blessed by the Lord. So it says in verse 4, Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. You see, that doesn't happen if you're not exceptional. You're a hard worker and maybe you have some problems or some flaws. This is a picture of somebody who is exceptional. You don't put someone in charge of everything unless you wholeheartedly, putting them in charge of everything and saying, okay, you're the man for the job. That means he was exceptional with his work, with his responsibility. That just doesn't happen unless you are exceptional. And so it says here that he attended him. So we already know that that's his master. And again, there's a difference between when we think of slavery, and we're going to go through all of this because a lot of critics of the Bible use that. There's a big difference between colonial slavery and the slavery that existed throughout all of the ancient world. It always, as far back as you go, it happened. And, today we have the prison system where we take away freedom away. And this was no different. Things like that occurred. This is what the world did. God made laws in his law so as to give compassion to those people, to give mercy on those people. It already existed in the world, and what God did is he made a law where justice could be shown to those people. And oftentimes, these were those who were criminals and they couldn't pay the debt. So that was the solution to how they could pay their debt back. But anyways, the reason why we bring this up here is because he's already a servant, not rightfully so. They tricked him. They sold him when he shouldn't have been sold. He didn't owe a debt. He, didn't do anything wrong. Again, that's kind of a foreshadowing of Christ too. But the fact is, the Bible text wants us to know that he attended him. This phrase shows, it's already given that that's his master. But on top of that, it shows a personal concern of Joseph. Just like when his father sent him out and go find your brothers, and he's going through all the fields. He's not only obeying his father, he actually cares about accomplishing the task. He's concerned, I'm not just obeying the father, let me get this over with. So no, Joseph is concerned with accomplishing what his father wants. And just the same way, this gives us a picture. He's serving Potiphar, but he also wants to attend him. He's concerned with being helpful to Potiphar. Now imagine being this kind of employee in the world, that's going to make an impact. When someone, so many times someone does that and say, oh, they want the promotion. But when someone starts to see you're not doing it for a promotion, this is just your character, then that's going to make a huge impact on anybody. So I think it's necessary to point that part out. So up until this point, that's all good. Everything's going extremely well. But, so we can pick up then in verse 6. So as long as we understand, Potiphar understands the blessing is of the Lord. But he continues now in verse 6. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So again, that doesn't happen. This Joseph was someone who could really be trusted, where you don't have to, it's integrity. You don't got to check up on them. And I don't know, maybe you've been an employer, or maybe you've experienced this as an employee, where it's like you just have a level of trust where no one's got to check up on you. If you're the employer, you never have to check up on anyone else. You just know that it's going to be taken care of with the top quality. And if you've experienced that, then that is something to be happy about. That is something, if you're a Christian and you know that, hey, my employer never has to worry about me, and he trusts me with all this, then that's something to be pleased with. And you should know that God looks at that and says, this type of person makes an impact in the world. Of course, you still want to plant the seed in there, throw some gospel in there, because that's how they're going to get the knowledge. But if this is there, that's a very good thing to have as a quality for yourself in life. So now everything's going well until we get to the end of verse 6. It says, I shouldn't say that, because there's nothing wrong with Joseph being handsome in form and appearance. But it's setting us up for what's going to happen next. So this evidently means he was in good shape. So he was handsome, and he was also in good shape. This is talking about his form. Now maybe because anyone who's worked in labor, how I got into doing a lot of warehouse stuff was because my first thing was production. And production, you're only getting paid based on what you do. And anyone knows who does that sort of thing, how fast you end up getting in shape doing that. I went to school, and all of a sudden I'm sitting at the desk, or even, preaching, and you have to go out and try and find, physical exercise if you're not working. If you're working a labor job, then it's like you don't, half the time you don't need to. And unless you want to do more than you can, but you're getting a lot of your exercise in. And so maybe this is a testament to Joseph's hard work. But except now someone is going to take advantage of a good thing. Because in verse 7 we have, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now, before we even get to his response, you know how rare that is. I mean, for any person in the world, you know how that wouldn't be the response. And for many people who are even in Christ, there would be that temptation there for many people. But Joseph is like, when you read his response, it's like how Job says that he made a covenant with his eyes, that he would not even look. And this is Joseph. His character is, he's not even going to open that jar. He's not even going to open that door for that to become a thing. And so his main concern is if he did it, that would be a sin against God. And he mentions Potiphar as well, but deep down to his core, and I think we have to emulate this, is our main motive, because it's not going to be pleasing to God. Because if it's something else, I'll get in trouble. This could hurt someone. And there could be other noble reasons. But that just means if I think I can avoid that, I'm going to try and get away with it. When our motive is, I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing, because it's pleasing to God. If we can get to that, then God's going to be able to trust us like this. And so sometimes we look at the consequences and we look at the hurt it caused, all these other things, and we should, because all those things are true. But we got to get to the point where we're going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Because we want to be pleasing to God before we even get to any of that. To Joseph, God was number one. And to us, God has got to be number one. So verse 10, it progresses. As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. And that means he's not even going near. And here we learn a valuable lesson. To lie beside her or to be with her. Now, we almost read that and we're like, well, of course he wouldn't do that. But that's kind of an expression to show us that he was not flirting around with it. He wasn't going near. The book of Proverbs talks about this young man who Solomon sees, and of course he's speaking in literature, but he's saying, I see a young man, and he takes the route by the foreign woman's house. And what he's saying is, he's not going to knock on the door, and he's not going to call her and everything. You know she's married, but he's going to take the route. He could go another route, but he's going to, just go by the house and see what happens. He knows what's going to happen. But sometimes we do that all the time. I'm not going to go. I'm not going after the temptation. I'm just going to go around it, And we know what we're doing. And so, and usually that's how it always happens in our mind. And so when we sense that, what's really going on, we got to cut it off right there. And we have to say, I know what I'm doing. I'm luring and enticing my own mind. And I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to go on that route. I'm going to go the route where I don't even come near that house, because I don't want to do this great wickedness and sin against God. So that expression, it's like common sense. You wouldn't do that, but that's the very point. He's not doing anything that will put him in that situation. He is steering clear from it. But verse 11, one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled. In my Bible, I have this word fled circled twice because it's repeated twice. And it is very, very important in understanding temptation. He left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Now, he was in that house for a reason. He's been responsible with his work and everything. But he's saying, I'm getting out of this house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. And he came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us, and catch what she's doing, whom you have brought, that's the guilt game, your fault, look what you've done. So now you should feel bad and do something to this guy. So that's the game she's playing. And whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me, to humiliate me. So this is what you did, Potiphar. You've humiliated me because this is what he tried to do. So you see the deceit here and the cunning. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled. There it is again. Actually, it's repeated 3 times. And fled out of the house. So what does God want us to know? He fled, he fled, he fled. Why does God want us to know? It's so important in temptation. God is saying, I want you to know that Joseph fled, he fled, he fled. Because we talk about temptation and we talk about, I'm going to battle temptation. I'm going to fight temptation. I'm going to overcome. I'm going to conquer. God says, flee, flee, flee. See, we don't get that fleeing in battle. We don't get the picture of bravery. We don't have a picture of courage. And isn't that kind of deceit? And that makes us not want to do it. Meanwhile, God wants us to know a man of God, a true strong man, someone who's able to defeat temptation like no one else can, because they don't have that kind of strength. A man of God flees from the temptation because he already knows, and he does what's necessary. But, again, in this circumstance, he wasn't rewarded. It says, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me. His anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, faithful love, and gave him favor, and that's grace, in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So it's that same principle there. And we kind of already talked about last time how a lot of times with Joseph, the circumstance wasn't good when he did the right thing. It didn't matter to him. He's going to please God. And we have to see that God has steadfast love. And sometimes, like Joseph, it may take 15 years. But we got to trust that God's working out the best case scenario for us and for others, which is the case with Joseph. I'm disappointed because I'm already out of time. But I wanted to go to 1 Corinthians 10 to talk about this temptation thing. But maybe I'll save that for next time, and maybe I'll just leave it up to, if you want to check this idea out, but I'll bring it up next time, that in Corinthians, in the topic of temptation, in fact, I've written the verse down here in the section with Joseph. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, a worthwhile study. He says, flee from sexual immorality. In chapter 10, verses 12 to 14, he says, therefore flee from idolatry. And that's the section where it says, no temptation has overtaken you except as is common to man, but God is faithful, and with the temptation he provides a way of escape. Sometimes when we read that verse, we say the way of escape is to fight. There's a way to, but the way of escape means run. The way of escape means flee. That is a section in the New Testament about temptation. So it's worthwhile to us to understand this idea of fleeing when it comes to temptation, if we really want to overcome it. So we'll kind of get into that next time. That shouldn't take long. We'll just finish that thought, and then we'll continue in chapter 40. But for now, we'll go ahead and offer an invitation for anyone who hasn't come to Christ and put him on in baptism. If you've decided that today's the day, then you have that invitation open. If you just need prayers of the congregation, please make it known as we stand and sing our invitation song.